Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. West Asia, U.S. sanctions and wars. That's in West Asia. And we have Dr. Faride Farhi to talk to us about this topic. Well, Faride, what do you think about the U.S. sanctions? Let's begin with that. And how many countries have been affected by that in the Middle East or in West Asia at least?
I guess I have to count. There are several, but generally speaking, sanctions, or what some people call economic war, as opposed to, I guess, physical, outright military war, has become a weapon of choice for United States in its relationship with other countries. Obviously, in the older days, before the Iran-Iraq war, if you remember the oil for food program, that was a very important, significant economic squeeze of the Iraqi system. Since then, and since the flushing of the world with American dollars after the 2008 economic breakdown, what we see today increasingly is the use of the banking system throughout the world to put an economic squeeze on many countries. I guess at this particular moment in history, the biggest squeeze is against the country of Iran, which is effectively under a complete sanctions regime. It's both an economic as well as a financial sanctions regime. So not only the country of Iran presumably cannot export its oil, that is to say, whoever buys Iranian oil will also be sanctioned. Even if it manages to sell that oil, because of the banking squeeze and banking sanctions, it has difficulty bringing back the proceeds from that sale. So despite the fact that the United States, for instance, says that it sanctions Iran completely, but it does not sanction Iran in terms of food and medicine, in effect, because of the banking sanction that exists. The Iranian central bank is sanctioned by the United States. It is very difficult for Iranians to pay for whatever they buy in the international market. Therefore, increasingly, companies, even pharmaceuticals, are not willing to deal with the Iranian economic system, either because they are worried that they will not get their money back for whatever they sell, or because they are afraid that United States will impose sanctions on them. So that's very much one part and parcel of what is going on in the Middle East. Of course, there are sanctions against Syria. I mean, outside the Middle East, you have sanctions against Russia. You have Venezuela, on and on. In Lebanon, you have sanctions against what the United States calls non-state actors, like Hezbollah and so on, and again against banks that deal with those entities. So it's become the weapon of choice in a political system that has increasingly become more worried about sending troops outside, individual Americans outside to fight, although that happens too, and has found this economic might to be an important tool for squeezing countries. The problem, however, is that the squeeze is there for these countries presumably to do something. In the case of the sanction regime against Iran, the idea is for Iran to engage in the United States to renegotiate the deal that was negotiated under the Obama administration, and also negotiate over Iran's activities in the Middle East. The Iranians effectively say no because presumably their economy is robust enough not to buckle in It harms the economy tremendously. It harms the people of Iran tremendously. However, it has not been sufficient for the Iranians to agree to American conditions. I also have to say that the United States has either used or threatened to use sanctions against even allied powers.
Europe,
Not only Europe, but also in the United States, in the Middle East, Turkey, for instance. Turkey, I mean, just yesterday,
recently,
just yesterday, Mr. Trump threatened Turkey total devastation of its economy, and claimed that it had done so in the past as well. So.
And he did that a while back with the exchange rate.
Exactly. What
between
happened?
The lira, Turkish lira,
exactly,
and the US
and they
dollar.
led to tremendous drop. It coincided with international dynamics as well, because it was exactly at the same time that Indonesian currency or Argentinian currency also dropped, but in Turkey, the American threat of sanctions effectively led to a 30% drop. The same dynamic was at play in Iran. That's why I say it's not merely just preventing sales or import of products. It's manipulation of the banking system and the currency system. So when the Trump administration, for instance, announced the nulling of the nuclear agreement in May 2017, what you saw, again, was a steep decline of Iranian currency. And that gave the American administration the idea that if we turn the sanction news, gradually, it will devastate the Iranian banking and currency system. So every couple of months, they would come up with new sanctions in order to engage in some sort of not only economic war, but also psychological war. I think after a while, the Iranians caught on and managed to bring some sort of stability to the currently dire situation. This is not to say that the situation is not dire. Iran is going through a 40% inflation rate, 12% unemployment rate, and so on. But the situation has become stabilized. The desire to turn this inflation rate into an even higher hyperinflation, as it has occurred, for example, in Venezuela, did not happen in Iran.
Yeah, and then they also have sanctions basically because of the dollar, their control of the dollar, the U.S. control of the dollar. They're sanctioning effectively food and medicine and everything else.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I was trying to say, that, the banking system, the global banking system has been set up in such a way that even if there is, for example, an exchange between Iran and China, okay, the way it operates is that the Chinese renminbi has to turn into dollars before, even for a second, before it turns, it's going through the international banking system. And that's the chokehold that the Americans are holding. That's why no bank is willing to deal with Iran at this particular moment. The Europeans have tried for the past couple of years, because they want to maintain the nuclear agreement, to create an exchange system called INSTEX. But it has hardly been operationalized. And the United States has threatened that if it becomes a venue through which Iranian oil money is transferred, then the United States will also sanction that mechanism, INSTEX itself, as well. But even for exchange of food and medicine, it has not become fully operationalized as well.
Yeah, and one reason actually is because the Europeans and the French basically were, the interlocutors with this, saying that this would be like, about $15 billion.
Euros,
$15 billion that, you would you give us something and we will give you like some dollars, just like for oil. It's just like oil for food program,
Well,
and
what-
not everything.
Yeah,
But the Iranians said no to that.
well, the idea was that the Iranian made an argument that this was actually a prepayment for the oil that Iran would be selling to anyone, because the United States, under the previous sanctions regime, there were exceptions because, for example, countries like Japan, India, or China
Iraq,
needed Iranian oil. United States would give them exceptions and effectively say, okay, you can import like 200,000 barrels a day from Iran, okay? But in the past few months, United States has effectively disbanded or gotten rid of all those exceptions. So effectively, it is asking the whole world not to buy a single amount, a single barrel of oil from Iran. The Iranians consider that to be unacceptable, an economic war. So the Europeans, wanting to remain within the nuclear agreement, came up with this idea that we'll give Iran this amount of money. Iranians said it's a prepayment. The Europeans said it's a loan. No, but it didn't fall on that. The Iranians, essentially, the argument was that what the French were trying to do is to make President Trump agree to some sort of easing of sanctions in order for the President of the United States and President of Iran to meet, making the argument that if they meet, Trump may change its mind. The Iranians essentially said, no, we will not meet with Trump because it's a photo opportunity. They would not even meet with him within the frame of the nuclear agreement, the 5 permanent members of United Nations plus Germany, unless United States lifts the sanctions that it had reimposed after the nuclear agreement. So all the activities that were going on in New York City in order to get these two presidents to meet was around this issue. And the Iranians just said, the foreign minister just said, the reason Rouhani ultimately did not want to meet with Trump was because in his United Nations speech, he effectively said that not only we will keep the sanctions, we will increase them. So he said, I kept asking the French president what to believe. You say that if we give you $15 billion and you meet with Trump, sanctions will be lifted. And here he is talking at the United Nations General Assembly, promising that there'll be more sanctions. They did not want to give what they called, the Iranians called that a photo opportunity, in the same way that had happened with the nuclear, North Korean situation, where there was a lot of excitement and opportunity, show, put on show, to say that there is something going on, but neither side had changed its position.
Yeah, because the astute observer would know that this is only a show. It's a show. Yeah, in terms of North Korea. But this guy leaves the nuclear deal, 5+1, in 2017. And then he basically wants to enter into negotiations with them. But who's to say that he wouldn't even leave that deal? You know what I'm saying?
And not only that, and I think the funny part of it is the dissonance within the administration. So you have people like the Secretary of State, Pompeo, talking about all sorts of demands on Iran. Iran changing its policies in the Middle East, treating its Hawaiʻi 12 demands. However, Trump himself says that the only thing I want from Iran is not to have nuclear weapons. Well, that was the nuclear agreement. The nuclear agreement was very clear that not only Iran would go under a very heavy inspection regime, but also promises not to produce nuclear weapons. And in fact, they got the supreme leader of Iran to make a public announcement that Iran will never have nuclear weapons. So it's not exactly clear what exactly they want from the Iranians, what Trump wants from the Iranians. The rest of the administration, as I said, were under the belief that if you squeeze Iran sufficiently, there would be trouble in Iran, and people will rise up, and ultimately there'll be a regime change.
That's Bolton, and
Bolton
before
and Pompeo
Pompeo,
himself.
yeah.
Pompeo
So
himself.
Bolton was bolted because
Bolton, but
because
Pompeo,
of Venezuela and this, and
Yeah.
we don't know what's going to happen to this guy,
to this
Pompeo.
Pompeo,
Yeah.
But Pompeo, I mean, that's what I'm saying. And Pompeo has shifted his position because, he wants to keep his job. Therefore, whatever Trump says, he shifts and changes.
Yeah.
But just recently, he went to a meeting in which the supporters of the meeting were members of the Iranian opposition, a discredited opposition.
Well, which one are you talking? Are you talking Bolton or
Pompeo
too?
Pompeo,
Yeah, because Bolton did that last year.
Yeah, but there was a meeting recently in New York that was supported by that group and by an organization that is called Nuclear Free Iran, which is a Saudi-Israeli supported organization that is, nuclear issue is essentially front for regime change in Iran, without having the means to do so, because the kind of opposition figures that they rely on, or opposition organizations, are highly discredited organizations inside Iran, even among folks who are very much opposed to the regime. So that's why I say it's a confused policy insofar as conflicting endgames. However, in terms of literal results, because it relies on this economic might and economic chokehold that the United States has on the banking system, the effective result is the squeezing of the Iranian population. Both economically, but also in terms of travels and so on.
No, even like Chinese companies cannot deal with
if
with
they
Iran.
have. See, what the United States says, this says this to the Europeans too, because Europeans no longer have a sanction regime against Iran. So what they are saying, for example, Total, the oil company. Total has
French company.
It's a French oil and gas company. It has economic interest in the United States. Okay, so it tells Total that if you go and engage in economic activities in Iran, in fact, they had a major deal to develop a gas field in Iran. That it eventually withdrew, then we will sanction you because of your operation in the United States.
That's right.
So obviously, all the major banks in the world, Deutsche Bank, in fact, Deutsche Bank was fined by United States a few years ago for its dealing with, people who engage in narcotics, but also terrorism. And when they say terrorism, they mean
they don't mean Daesh or ISIS.
They mean what they call Iran, the state sponsor of terrorism.
Right.
So it was actually its dealings with Iran that caused it to. And these fines are not changed. Like Paribas.
Paribas too,
was fined something like $7 billion.
That's right.
So that clearly takes out the idea of any country investing in Iran, any companies.
In terms of companies.
But then the Europeans who want to keep this nuclear agreement cannot force their companies to invest in Iran. So what they try to do is to develop some sort of state-sponsored exchange system, as I said, which hasn't been working because, again, they're having
with Europe, because he can squeeze them like Trump or the United States in different ways because they are tied to the U.S. in multiple ways.
Exactly. So what has happened is that First of all, you know, when you have a sanctions regime, quote unquote, level of corruption goes up. Why? Because everything becomes underhanded. Okay, so you know, oil is being exported, but you know, is being exported in underhanded, hidden ways. And although countries are trying to track it, you know, ultimately it's difficult to do.
Yeah.
And also, if you look at the map of Iran, Iran is centrally located, so it's surrounded.
Yeah, we can look at the map. That's just to show it. Yeah. So there is Iran.
Yeah.
Right.
So Iraq is next door. Okay. So you know, Turkey is
Iran,
next door.
yeah.
Afghanistan is next door. Pakistan is next door. You have all these Central
This is about
Asian.
13, 14
Yeah,
countries.
exactly.
You know.
So, you know, again, you have a situation, you know, Iranians will end up undercutting the price, the gas that they are selling, the crude oil that they are selling, you know, at 20%. So it's harming the Iranian economy, but it's not killing it.
Yeah, right.
And, you know, so the Iranian leadership has decided to limp along and sort of wait and see what happens until the Americans get tired of this.
Yeah, so this is one thing. The other thing now, recent news, like a few weeks or several weeks, is that the Chinese government, the Chinese state, is importing oil from Iran. And you like the barter system and stuff like that, because what is the U.S. gonna do? Like put sanctions on China? That would be like a problem.
They have threatened. They have
they
threatened.
have threatened.
They have threatened, and they do. They do
well,
put sanctions on companies that deal. Like, for example, there was a bank, the Kunlun Bank, that they sanctioned that bank. The same thing with Turkish banks. What has happened is that increasingly countries that are under these sanction regimes, various sanctions regimes, including, for example, Russia and Iran, are using their own currency.
Yes.
So, for example, the other day I read that something like 40% of the exchanges that occur between Iran and Turkey is now in local currency.
Exactly.
Because Turkey is dependent on Iranian natural gas, and then Iranians also import. The other day there was also a story. I do not know how true that is, but it was really a funny, ironic, possibility that after there was an attack against the Saudi oil refinery, Aramco refinery. The Saudis were, a significant part of their production had dropped, and they had all these customers that they had promised. So they were buying oil from Iraq to sell to these customers. This was the story. I do not know. And of course, the Iraqis were importing from Iran to give it to the Saudis. Whether that's true or not, I do not know, and I don't put a lot of confidence in the story. But that's how markets end up working when smuggling and becomes a way because of these larger sanction regimes that are imposed. I mean, Iranians have to export their oil. They will do so one way or another, not necessarily in terms of the numbers that they used to do before, but they will try to export as much as possible, and there are sufficient or at least there are some organizations as well as countries that are surrounding Iran that are somehow willing to cooperate in that regard. Why? Because they get cheaper oil, because they get some sort of commission out of this, as I said, ultimately the Iranian economy is suffering, but it's not being killed.
It's not gonna die. So that's one thing. I mean, I thought that the Chinese state importing from Iran oil is a significant
Well, they
thing.
they have always done so. They have also
From well, they were one of the exceptional countries, like 8 countries. They were one of them.
They were one of them, but now they are. I mean, no, there are no exceptions.
Yeah, now no exceptions, but they are doing it. You know, that's the
exactly.
latest thing. The other thing is that when we talk about sanctions, you know, U.S. sanctions, these are not UN sanctioned sanctions. You see what I'm saying? So they are illegal in terms of international law because they are not sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council, like the ones that were put upon Iran while they were still working
under
the deal.
Obama administration. Yes,
Right.
not only that, but you also had EU sanctions on Iran.
Yeah,
so
before.
You had Iran since 2006 had gone. Its case had gone to the Security Council and had been placed under Chapter 7, which is a threat to international peace and security. So those kind of sanctions that were imposed by the Obama administrations increasingly, I mean, first by the Bush administration, but then in a very effective way by the Obama administration, was because they had the backing of the Security Councils.
Exactly.
Russia and China did not object.
Yeah.
Also, they were able to bring the EU in. So it was an extremely effective mechanism for sanctions, and it had legitimacy.
Yeah.
So when the Trump administration came in and said, I'm going to impose even tougher sanctions on Iran, everybody said, you can't do it because it doesn't have the UN backing and EU backing. However, people who said that had not realized what had happened to the world since 2008 economic breakdown, and how the world had become dollarized in significant way when United States essentially flushed the world with these dollars, you know.
That's right.
So even people like me who thought that the sanction regime would not be as effective as the Trump administrations were surprised at the effectiveness of the sanctions regime, precisely because even when they are done unilaterally and, as you say, quote unquote, illegally, because it's effectively choking a country into starvation. That's the intent. The fact that the country is able to counter that is irrelevant to the intent of what those who are planning to do the sanctions. And Trump himself says it outright that I'm going to. My intent is to destroy the economy of these countries, so they go on their knees and come and beg for negotiation. So the fact that that hasn't happened does not take away from the intent of what the United States is doing.
Yeah, the sanctions. I mean, the let me put it this way: the U.S. illegal sanctions against all these countries is because there's not sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council. That's one. The other thing, they are very effective, right? But that's not the argument. The argument that some people wouldn't call them sanctions because they are illegal. It is a war, a war instrument. And actually, if you put sanctions on China or Russia or Iran, it is an act of war. That's how they look at it.
The Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif calls it economic terrorism.
Yeah, well.
So because you are effectively, what is terrorism? The idea of terrorism is that you attack a target in order to create terror, not necessarily directly attack, but to create terror and fear, and you have all this collateral damage.
Yes.
So sanction, the American government says that the sanction regime is directed against the government of Iran. The Iranian foreign minister, himself is sanctions and cannot
yeah.
come to United States.
And
Only-
even Khamenei, the
Khamenei,
supreme
well,
leader.
he never travels.
Yeah, but
You know, the Iranian foreign minister, his job is to travel. So when he comes to New York, he can only go to 3 buildings now. I mean, even before the Iranian
were confined to.
to
even
25,
Rouhani one was
25 miles. They can never go beyond
Mm.
that. But now they can only go to the place of residence, to the mission, and then to
The
United
UN.
Nations. So that's what I mean, this is how vindictive and pointless, I have to say, because the idea is to prevent this guy from talking to anybody. Well, then all the TV channels in the United States had to go to his residence to do interview with him. So, but that's the extent of, you know, and that is why it has become the only tool that United States seems to have. And that is why, you know, when President Trump tweets that President Erdogan knows that, you know, I can destroy
the economy.
You're sitting there and saying, are you kidding me? You know, is this the only thing that has been left? You know, we are talking about economies that are not tiny. We are talking about economies that are, you know, include something between 80 to 85 million people each. They are among the top 20 economies of the world in terms of gross national product. Even Iran, I mean, Turkey is a little bit ahead of Iran, but still they are in the top 20 largest economies of Iran. It is true of the world. It is true that in the case of a country like Iran, the export portfolio is not as diversified as Turkey, and Iran is more reliant on the export of oil and gas. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have anything else to export, or it has a large internal market itself, and it produces stuff for its own population. So to sort of assume that you can just, you know, try to close every hole so they cannot export oil, gas, petrochemicals, whatever, and banking system, the whole economy will, you know, tumble, I think is a highly, highly problematic understanding of your own
So
power.
they're still waiting for the Iranian economy to just like, you know, implode, shall we say.
But you know, from Trump's understanding, I'm waiting for them to come and beg to renegotiate, you know. And of course, from the other side, the Iranian supreme leader, but on this issue, there is no disagreement inside Iran, precisely because coming to ask for negotiation will be perceived as Iran caving in. He's saying, in fact, he says that if we go and negotiate with the United States, they think we are going to negotiate out of desperation. So there is no way.
No, they wouldn't. I mean, that's their decision.
So if they say, if United States comes back to the nuclear agreement, to P5+1, and in order to come back, it has to lift sanctions first, we'll talk to the United States.
Which the U.S. is not going to do either.
Which the U.S. is not
so it's like a, you know, cul-de-sac basically in politics.
Exactly. And no matter how much the Europeans or, you know, somebody like French President Macron has his own reasons to become so involved. He likes international standing, improved standing. The Europeans are worried about instability and war in the Middle East because you have more refugees coming to Europe for whatever reason. No matter how much they tried, it doesn't work because what they are asking is essentially trying to bring two positions together that are impossible to bring together.
And in fact, when Rouhani was in the UN, the French were making a joke. Well, if you don't want to meet with Trump, what if like we drop you both in one pool?
Yeah, exactly. Both jump at the same time. I think that's what Boris Johnson said. You know, both of you jump over
Boris,
here.
yeah.
Both
Boris,
of you
yeah.
jump at the same time.
Right.
Well, the problem is that United States is the more powerful party, and it's also the more unreliable party.
Right.
Therefore, jumping into a pool with an unreliable and more powerful party is a very dangerous. So you're a much safer position to not jump.
Yeah.
And ask for the other guy to jump first. And that's what Rouhani had asked Trump to announce, that if they meet, he will reduce the sanctions. He wanted Trump to say so publicly. And of course, not only Trump did not do that, he went to United Nations General Assembly and said, I'm going to increase the sanctions. And then afterwards, he also went on Twitter and said the Iranians were begging me to meet, but I didn't meet. So, you know, which was not true.
Yeah, he's a liar.
But so, you know, the Iranians had every reason not to trust.
Yeah, even if he would say, yeah, I'll do that, you know, I mean, then he would tweet, oh, no, I just was playing, you know.
Exactly.
So that's not, you know, important thing. But the main thing is that this is, you know, you people look at it as an act of war. Why? Because you're going to like destroy the state, you know, and all the institutions of the, you know, Iranian regime, of the Iranian state. Therefore, it's war. Well, I mean, you go to war with guns and ammunition and soldiers to do that. So if you can do it through like those kind of sanctions, then it's the same kind of strategic goal you would, you know, achieve, or you think you would. You know.
It's the same dynamic, you know, as bombing a country through air. It ultimately does not, you know, it requires, if you want to have a regime change in another country, as you know, you need troops on the ground, boots on the ground. And of course, after what happened in Iraq, even if you have boots on the ground and are successful in regime change, it ends up being not what you expected.
Yeah, exactly.
And remember, you know, in the case of Iraq is at that time of invasion less than 30 million people.
25 actually.
25 to 30. Iran is 80 million people. The terrain is not flat like Iraq. It is totally mountainous like Afghanistan. And it's just you know, and it has developed internal capabilities that it can respond back. So if you remember, a couple of months ago, the Iranians shot down a very sophisticated and I might say expensive American drone
like
that
$200 million.
That the Iranians claimed had trespassed the Iranian territory. And that's why. And they also immediately pointed out that there was a plane, a surveillance plane that was accompanying that drone, and they had the capability to attack that.
But they didn't.
But they didn't, because there were about 30 personnel in that plane. Now, that created all sorts of reaction in Washington. The Americans claimed that that drone was not in Iranian territory.
Well, the Iranians showed the videos.
But and then you know, there was all sorts of talks about how to react to this and whether to attack. And then Trump, in the last minute, said, "I decided I don't want to kill people," and I pulled back. But the reality is that attacking Iran
is not a walk in the park.
It's not in the park. The same dynamic was at play when the Saudi oil installations were attacked, the Aramco installation. I'm one of those people who is very suspicious about whether or not Iran did it or not. I don't think Iran did it, but almost everybody agrees in Washington, that it was Iran that did it.
Yeah, but without any proof.
Without any evidence.
No
But
evidence.
nevertheless, let us say, but it's irrelevant whether Iran did it or not, because if Iran did it, in fact,
Why don't they go and shoot at Iran?
yeah,
You see what I mean?
but that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
The point is that it means that Saudi oil installations are extremely vulnerable.
Vulnerable, yeah.
Okay, so attacking Iran for an egregious act, let us say Iranians did the Aramco thing, the Iranians made very clear that if they are attacked, they will attack back. And all these Persian Gulf states, Saudi Arabia being the largest one, but you have United Arab Emirates, you have Kuwait, you have Qatar, all those countries become extremely vulnerable themselves, but also because American bases are in every single one of them. So, that reality is the reality of the Syria. Iran will be destroyed. Iran will be tremendously harmed, but that doesn't mean it does not have the capability to attack back. Yeah. And I think that's what, makes people cautious.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you see this tremendous effort to blame everything that happens in the Middle East on the Iranians. But then on the other hand, if the Iranians are responsible for everything that happens, and United States is so powerful, and Iran, why aren't they doing anything about what the Iranians are doing in the Middle East?
That's right.
That dynamic is a dynamic that continues to be part of the play in every event that occurs. Every event, ships are attacked in United Arab Emirates, the Iranians must have done it. Again, without any evidence. Because Iranians are bad actors, okay? And because logically, the Iranians should do it because they are being faced with an atrocious economic war. They are being squeezed. So this is their way of responding back to break the squeeze. So they give both intentionality to the action as well as an objective interest in doing it. But again, ultimately, no evidence is offered, and then nothing happens either in terms of military action.
Yeah. But also, the Iranians sent direct, messages to the U.S. They said basically if even one rocket hits the desert, it's gonna be all-out war. Meaning, as you mentioned, the U.S. bases and those regimes, like Saudi Arabia, would be completely destroyed. And some were talking about U.S. bases in Europe that it could
Iranians,
be done. But
Iranians can boast too.
I know. But I'm saying that there are U.S. bases there that
the
can be
Iranians
harmed.
immediately sent a message that if Iranian territory is attacked in the same way that Trump had talked about, targets had been identified and United States was ready to go and attack those targets. Iranians sent a message immediately after the Aramco attack, when everybody said that the Iranians did it, that if Iran is attacked, they will respond. They will respond. And given the fact that they were putting the blame of the Aramco attack on the Iranians, therefore the Iranians are capable of hitting.
Right.
That's that's the logic of what you're saying, is that if the Iran, you're damned if you do, if you're damned if you do not, because if you blame the Iranians, that means they have the capability to do so. If you don't blame the Iranians, then who did it? And
the other thing is this front, which is the resistance front against U.S. Presence and domination of the region, said if an attack on one is an attack on all. So that is an important thing, because you have, I mean, U.S. cares a lot about, the state of Israel, right, and Palestine.
And Saudi Arabia.
And Saudi Arabia. So if the U.S. would lose, the state of Israel, and then Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar, etc., then that would weaken its position in the area, even if, like, Iran was destroyed completely, because the U.S. will have to pay a lot for that, in terms of bases destroyed and all of that kind of thing. So that's an important thing. Now, here, like, in terms of the sanctions as well, I mean, you mentioned that, but maybe, like, talk a little bit about it, a bit more about it, which is the Iranian domestic market. I mean, a lot of stuff happens in the domestic market, right? I mean, a lot of interaction and
Well, it's an 80, as I said, 80 million people economy. It produces quite a bit of its food domestically. It has it engages in all sorts of scientific research. It has a military-industrial complex. I mean, part of what has happened on the broader sanction regime that has existed on Iran since its revolution is that it has developed a military industry. As you know, in the case of United States, military industry also promotes all sorts of side industries, whether it's in cyberspace or advanced technology on different kind of things, in pharmaceutical, all sorts of things. Iran does have I cannot say its economy is not, it's well or it's healthy, because it's still quite dependent on export of oil and gas. What people do not know is Iran is not only oil rich, it's extremely gas rich. So effectively the whole country is now, even in the rural areas, natural gas is a source of fuel for the whole country. And then it has all these relationships with the neighboring countries. Including Iraq right now, where you have a very vibrant tourism interaction or pilgrimage interaction between the two countries. Just a few days from now is what is called the Arba'in ceremony, the 40th day of Imam Hussein's martyrdom. 1400 years ago, and anywhere between 2 to 3 million Iranians will walk, literally, going through, despite all the turmoil that now exists in Iraq, to Karbala, from Najaf to Karbala, to engage in this ceremony. They contribute to the Iraqi economy, vice versa. The Iraqis come to the holy cities in Iran. So there is a lot more integration because of what has happened. Similar dynamics in a different way are at play between Iran and Turkey. Iran also has a vibrant relationship with the Kurdistan regional government, the Kurdish part of the state of Iraq. So, it's difficult. It's not, as I said, it's not a country that can be counted that easily. And it has a history of putting up a lot. It has gone through a war with the neighboring country and so on. So it's difficult. It's not difficult to harm it, but it's also not easy.
Difficult to win over it.
Win over it.
You can destroy it, but doesn't mean you win. They destroyed Iraq, but they didn't win in Iraq. They're trying again now, and so on.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but actually, in terms, it has been said, and I agree with that, that actually it's not the nuclear deal that Trump is really dealing with, but this is an excuse for him, because he wants to stop Iran from helping resistance movements that work against Israel, and resistance movements that help the Syrian state to remain intact and not be shattered into so many divisions and all of that kind of stuff. And in fact, he wants the role of Iran to, Iran's role in the region to stop, from supporting those things. And so therefore we have all those wars that the U.S. has been sanctioning or giving the green light for. One example would be the Yemen, And the Iranians say, well, we are part of the region, So why don't, and we have national interest. I mean, the U.S. comes from the Atlantic, or the Pacific, all the way to, the Persian Gulf, etc., for its own interests, and Iran is right there, so it doesn't have national interest, etc. So that is the thing in terms of domination.
That's not only the Trump administration. I mean, United States policy has always been, you have
Obama and the Yemen,
the nuclear agreement, but also to stop Iran's nefarious activities. Now, the decision by the Obama administration and, of course, the Iranians together to separate and only negotiate over the nuclear agreement was, they say, premised on the belief that if you have an agreement on nuclear issue, slowly it will open Iran up and reduces its nefarious
in quotes. I mean,
exactly.
Because the U.S. has so many nefarious stuff all over the world.
Its activities in the region. Then they say no, and then the Syria flare up, and the decision by the Syrian government to invite Iran into Syria. Then the ISIS attack in Iraq, the decision by the Iraqi government and the Kurdistan regional government to invite Iran to help to fight ISIS.
Because Baghdad was about to fall.
Exactly. So what happened was that suddenly Iran's nefarious activities in the fight against ISIS increased. So the argument initially was that no, Obama made a mistake and the nuclear agreement did not lead to a better behaved Iran. Forget about the fact that Iran and United States were cooperating in the fight against ISIS in Iraq, initially at least. United States was giving air cover, the Iranians were helping the militias inside Iraq. So they said Iranian nefarious activities increased. So Trump comes and says, okay, no, nuclear agreement was a bad deal. We gave Iran $150 billion, which is nonsense. That's not true. And it was a bad deal. It didn't stop their nuclear program, and it didn't stop their nefarious activities, quote unquote. So it withdraws from the nuclear deal, imposes all these sanctions. Then, drone is attacked, brought down. Aramco is attacked. Tankers are attacked. Oh, it's Iran, and Iran's nefarious activities have become even more. So, and everybody said it's your fault because you withdrew from the nuclear agreement. So that's why I say you end up making all these extremely confused arguments, sort of going, twisting and turning contorted to sort of come up with an argument why withdrawing from the nuclear agreement has led to, for a while, Trump used to say, if you remember, that Iran has become a much better actor in the region, if you remember, because I withdrew. But now that Aramco has attacked, and tankers have been attacked, and the United States has made the decision without offering us evidence to blame Iran, they cannot talk about the fact that withdrawal has led to a better behaved Iran. So, the confusion continues, but the dynamic that the only tool the United States has is effectively bullying and squeezing
Yeah.
continues.
Yeah, I was watching an Arabic program, TV program, where there was an ex U.S. Department, the State Department, official, who's of Arab origin, I think Lebanese or Palestinian. His name Nabil Khouri, and he was the other guest cornered him and say, "Look at Obama when he started the war, etc. in Yemen. He gave the green light, etc." And in fact, the U.S. at that time giving like AWACS, surveillance and all of that, so helping out, the Saudis in that for targets and so on. So he said, well, this is one of the things I criticize Obama for. But then he said, but the reason he did it, he thought that within 2 months of the war, the Yemenis would like give up and everything would be hunky-dory, which means like, U.S. domination of Yemen would be complete via, Saudi Arabia, etc. But to me, this is like excuse is worse than the crime itself of starting a war, and this is like
especially after us going through Iraq, that was supposed to be a cakewalk.
Right,
remember Dick Cheney?
They don't
I mean,
learn, they don't learn.
that has and that continues to be a situation that part of the decision-making dynamics in the United States, despite the fact that it has repeatedly been shown that it's a false premise. It is true, United States has tremendous technological capabilities.
Yeah, sure.
But it also has
but
limitations.
Can it use it? Can it use it in the presence of Russian Federation inside, in the militarily in West Asia, Syria, and is trying to move outward, for the rest of West Asia, and also the Chinese, etc. So it is a very dangerous situation that way, and that's why these are the limits on U.S. power. Although it is the most powerful country in the world and all of that, but can it use that power effectively?
It can destroy,
but can it use it effectively?
Yeah, and it cannot shape it in ways that it it wants to. It has a destructive power. So it can bomb, it can sanction, in a very cruel way. But it cannot reshape it in ways that part of it also has to do with the fact that it really doesn't know how it wants to reshape either.
Yeah, because there's all kinds of ruling class in the United States is divided about that kind of thing. So there's confusion and no real planning, strategy, etc. So that is a big problem. Plus, the people in the United States now don't really fancy another war, especially we have been in Afghanistan for 18 years, and we don't know how to get out of there. And so the Taliban, who were sanctioned as like terrorists, now we have good Taliban, bad Taliban, and the U.S. is like negotiating with the good Taliban, right? In Qatar and
we don't know, but then suddenly it puts it,
and then he said, no, I don't want to negotiate. But no, the thing is that they trying to figure out a way to get out of Afghanistan, but so far they have been unable to do so, very unsuccessful about that. So, I mean, those wars in the Middle East, you have like, I mean, in West Asia, forget about Libya and and the Sinai with Egypt, etc. There are wars happening there. But you have the Syrian war, you have Lebanon could flare up at any time, and they are at war with the state of Israel and Palestine. There are problems in Palestine now. There's the Yemen war, and there are attempts to try and get Iraq going again, at war. So
and
all
Turkey
these kinds of stuff. Turkey invading Syria and being in Syria as well. So these are dangerous stuff. So anyway, we are basically flat out of time. And thank you very much for coming over and updating, the whole situation in West Asia. You being like expert in Iranian politics and U.S. politics in the region and so forth. So thank you very much, and thank you for our viewers. Mahalo nui loa, and see you next month. Aloha.